It's an absolute pleasure to welcome our keynote panel. It's in our hands to shape the future. The panel is Kate Raworth, who is the co-founder of Donut Economics, the most incredibly optimistic book, which I would recommend to all of you. Amanda Parker, a cultural policy consultant and founder of Inc. Arts. And Amanda will also be acting as our keynote listener throughout the day. And Ben Twist, the founder of Creative Carbon Scotland. Do come to the stage.
Great, thanks. Hi, I'm Kate Raworth. I'm here because I'm a renegade economist. Just a question. Put up your hand if you ever studied economics at school or university. Okay, a smattering. So, congratulations if you did. Congratulations if you didn't. You may have saved yourself the 20th century intellectual baggage that many of us carry. I've got a lot of it. But if you didn't, don't get too pleased with yourself, because even if you never studied economics, it definitely studied you. We all swim in the economic water. Our culture is based in a deeply economic mindset, and I want to just make some of that visible to us right now. And I want to focus particularly on humanity and our relationship to the rest of the living world. So in economics, if you studied 20th century economics, the character of humanity is the place at the heart of it. It's called rational economic man. Now, his portrait, his physical picture, is never actually drawn in the textbooks. He's described in equations, but pictures matter, you know that. So I decided to give him a portrait, and he'd have to look something like this. He'd be a man, he's got no dependents, stands alone, he's got money in his hand, that's how he interacts with the world. He's got ego in his heart, he's got a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. Dominion over everything. He hates work, he loves luxury, he knows the price of it all. The trouble with this character, and it's been proven in research, is that the more the students learn about rational economic man, the more they actually seek to emulate him, the more they value competition over collaboration, the more they value self-interest over altruism. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. And if we think of ourselves at the peak of nature, we see nature's materials as our resources, like Lego blocks to make things out of and then discard and find some new ones. And this goes so closely together with the industrial system that we've inherited. It's linear industrial design. We take, make, use, lose. And I don't want this to be entirely conceptual, so grab some real-world materials and ask for the help of my wonderful fellow panelists. Ta-da! My wonderful assistants. Hold these together. Amanda, that's it. So this is, aren't they wonderful? The linear industrial system that we've inherited, right? What we do is we take Earth's material, stick it in the pipe of production. We make it into stuff we want. We use it, often only once, and then throw it away. And then we chuck the waste out the bottom, and it goes away. This is what is causing the climate crisis and ecological breakdown. We are pushing ourselves over planetary boundaries, running down the life support systems of this only known living planet in the universe. So, we have to first recognize we are not at the peak of the pyramid of the web of life. We are a member of it, embedded within it. And I'm so glad the web of life is on the stage behind us with its beautiful set. We are part of that web and utterly dependent upon it. And so we need to make economic systems and material systems that respect and recognize and dance with that. We need to separate the materials we have into the ecological, the natural, that would, if we put them back in the ground, that would just decompose, and nature would brilliantly bring them back as a peacock or a cloud or a flower or something else. And the technical materials, human-made materials, that we've changed. And so they won't decompose because we've transformed them. And we need to bend the arrows around and make circular loops. And it's not as easy as it looks. I have to let you know. It's not, right? And that's why we're here, because it's not as easy as it looks. So this is what nature does. She just regenerates. She's got this incredible generosity of regenerating life again and again. We need to enable all natural fibers and materials, cotton and wood and anything in this room that's natural. How can it be used until it ultimately can only be reused by decomposing? And then with human-made materials, they won't decompose. So we need to mimic nature by Sharing. Sharing what we have, repairing it, restoring it, refurbishing it, reinventing it, only ultimately recycling it, but never thinking we're going to throw it away, because there is no away. Could you give them a round of applause? This is so... Yeah, there we are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And of course, bits come out, right? Nothing is ever perfectly circular, so we need to use them with great care. Now, how do we create this circular, regenerative economy where we see ourselves as part of the living world? It's so easy to stand on a stage and talk about it. How are you going to bring it alive in your theatres and your productions? And this is where we get serious. I offer you 5 deep design traits of organizations, and I invite you to think, whether it's your theatre, your production, think about these design traits, because this is what determines whether or not we're stuck in the linear, degenerative world, using up Earth's materials, or whether we can actually move to a regenerative one where we see ourselves and become part of the web of life. So, think these through for yourselves. First, what is your purpose? Why does your theatre or your production even exist? What is it in service of in the world? How can it help to meet the needs of all people, bringing us back within the means of the planet, tackling climate and ecological crisis? What steps can it take towards that? Second, the networks of relationship. All the relationships you have with your actors, your team, your suppliers, your audience, those you procure from, those you pass on the materials to. Do you live out those values? Can you create that regenerative relationship with them? And what would it take? And Rufus was starting to talk about that. Give us lead time, give us warning, so that we actually have the time to care and to use materials and energy well. Governance. How is your theatre governed? Who's in the room? Who has the seat at the table? Who has voice? Does nature have a voice? You know, the shampoo company Faith and Nature have recently given nature a voice on the board, held by an environmental lawyer. What if every theatre actually literally had a place on the board for nature, saying, this is what nature would want us to do. Take it into account in our decisions. What are the metrics of success of your theatre, of your production, and how do they govern fulfilling your purpose? Let's go deeper, right? This board is like psychotherapy. The deeper we go, the more profound it gets. So how is the theatre owned? Is it privately owned? Is it owned by a local authority? Is it a charity? Because how it's owned is obviously going to have a huge implication for how it's financed. Is the money coming from grants? Is it coming from earned income? Is it coming from sponsorship? What's the balance, the tension between these? And these 5 design traits, of course, are dancing in tension a lot of the time. And they're often touching on issues that are never discussed. I've talked about this with many companies and organizations, and the first thing people say is, you mean we're actually going to talk about this? We're actually going to talk about how we're owned and sponsored and financed. Yes, we have to, because culture may be, as Rob Hopkins says, a prime way to transform, but culture sits in institutions, and institutions have deep design, and you're always connected to how things are governed and owned and financed, and that is shaping the water in that you're working. So ask yourself, is your theatre ultimately actually driven by the way it's owned and financed, and that's pushing back against your purpose, which in the worst case scenario just ends up as a nice strapline on the website? Or are you really able to hold that purpose and align the networks of who you choose to work with and who you don't choose to work with, how it's governed, who has voice and the metrics, how you're owned, and ultimately that finance, where it's coming from, what it's asking for, what it's giving, so that you can align those together. So I invite you to think not only about the design of the materials in your productions, but the deep design of your organizations, because that is where we ultimately need to transform. Thank you.
Sorry? I don't have slides. Thank you everyone involved in putting me here to talk to you today. I want to start with a confession and an invitation. And a confession, I hope, that helps to kind of generate a really frank conversation that we need to have today. So I'm putting myself in the line there. For that, I do need to take my specs off because I can't see. Where am I supposed to? my confession is followed by an invitation for us to use today to put at the core of all we do equity in this conversation. Before we take action, let's make it equitable. So I also want to invite you to think, when I use the phrase marginalized people when I talk, kind of substitute it for freelancers or smaller theatre organizations, because I want you to use the theatre ecology as a metaphor for the wider universe, because we know the world within a world is theatre, right? And there are so many parallels that can help us explore the solutions to taking collective, sector-wide action on climate change. So my confession, when Zoe kindly asked me to take part, I really, really wanted to say no. I was just like, it's not for me, I'm not interested, it's not my fight, it's not what I do in the sector. It's on my to-do list, but it's somewhere below when we deal with racism, ableism, classism, then I'll get to climate action, and that's the truth. So it's on my to-do list. That might resonate with some of you. Maybe not many in this room, but for many marginalized people who daily step into the fray of injustice just by living their life, it's on the to-do list. It's just not a priority. And it might resonate with some of the people that you engage with, the communities you work with, the communities that help you demonstrate to the Arts Council that you are dedicated and mean their investment principles will come alive in your space. So why does climate justice feel like a dialogue of privilege? Because agency is important, vital. Having the means to make change, having the voice and the space to engage. So why do many marginalized people tune out? Because so many of the ideas, solutions, mitigations, adaptations for climate solutions are done to and not with. Because so much of this, both our action and inaction, affects marginalized people the most. We know this, despite them having the least agency to drive that change, because power typically speaks to power and typically doesn't look like us, because frankly, we've got so much else to navigate. Activists have coined the term environmental racism to refer to when neighborhoods and densely populated by ethnically diverse Black and Asian communities have a disproportionate number of environmental hazards and sources of pollution that lower the quality of life. In my thinking, at least, I'd like to refine that to say classism and ableism is affected as well. And we understand this on a global scale. Global South nations are already suffering the results of our actions and abuse of Earth's resources. But it's happening nationally, locally, and in our sector too. And if I go to London and I think about ULEZ, it only matters to people who have cars, can afford to run cars, because everybody else is already on the buses and the trams. They've already done the adaptation that you've suggested, the mitigation that you've suggested. For those already living at the margins, the costs of, or the pros and cons of having the heat pumps loan credits means nothing at all, because they're lucky if their boilers are working. It's just not on the agenda. It's beyond financial consideration. So the people who've already cut their consumption to the quick, who don't have the resource, financial or time to do more than what they're doing to remain economically and emotionally viable, for them, climate action feels like a luxury they don't have time for. And also, activism can be a dangerous place. So for people who experience disproportionately high levels of arrest or harsher sentencing, you might think twice about your choice to jump to support the right to protest and exercise your own right to process. So what can we do to make this vital work feel less of a privilege and more like the universal urgency that it actually is? The first thing to do is to understand what we mean by climate justice. And what's weird about my instinctive desire to say no to today's conversation is that I truly believe, I deeply believe, and I want to leave this with you, that EDI is ESG. It's one and the same thing. The narrative about equity, diversity, and inclusion is inextricably about the dialogue of environment, social, and governance. You can't have one without the other. So when we think about adaptive methods of redistributing resources, say, again, put in mind the smaller company, the larger company, we have to not just work out what is fair and distributive, redistributing resources, we also have to work out how does that impact on the big, on the small, on the individuals, and importantly, who's got a voice in that conversation. So my request to you, as I'm so running out of time, is about adaptation, taking into account recognition of those voices, collaboration that is all through from your front of house, with your technical staff, with your learning and development teams and everybody else, and your communities. How to make everybody part of that conversation starts with a genuine understanding that EDI is ESG. I'd actually welcome using the term environmental and social equity. Thank you.
The title of this panel is, "It is in our hands to shape the future." And I'd say that we have the choice to make it a good future or a bad one. Since 1989, humans have caused more greenhouse gas emissions than in all of the human history before then. And this is largely due to the enormous increase in consumption that has taken place in the last few decades. And consumption, by the way, that we're all part of. And that's depressing. But it also points to an optimistic possibility. If we can do so much damage in just 35 years, perhaps we can dramatically change the course and reverse at least some of that damage in the next 30 or so before that 2050 deadline. But to do so, we'll have to work just as hard at reducing consumption, ending the extractive consumption that Kate has spoken about, and undoing the inequality that Amanda has described, just as hard as we have worked on increased consumption in the last years. And to do this, we need to change the discourse. We need to change the narrative. We need a paradigm shift, to coin a phrase. But to shift paradigms, we need to know not only what is wrong with the current paradigm, we need a new one to shift to. And Kate has outlined the start of another narrative, but that isn't widely understood or accepted. And I think it's still hard for most of us to imagine what society would look like if it was adopted. But my point is, isn't this what theatre does? It excels at imagining different futures. It asks what if, and then undertakes a thought experiment with the audience where we collectively explore the set of circumstances that what if proposes. And we're privileged because when people buy a theatre ticket, they're not only giving us their money, they're also giving us their time, and they're lending us their brains. And more than this, they agree when they come to the theatre to work collectively with all the other people in the audience and on the stage and behind it to think about the things that we ask them to think about. And that's important, as climate change isn't going to be solved by individual actions, but by collective change. And as you all know, audiences are cleverer and think faster than individuals on their own. So society needs us to help those brains think together to change the narrative. But we can't change the national narrative if we don't change the internal one. So what does this mean for directors, practically? I'm going to take a couple of examples from the Green Book, Theatre Green Book, which may seem like production manager things, but are really about the leadership of the director. The Green Book says, turn the white card meeting into a green card meeting. This sets the tone for everyone. And you doing this says this is important. This is intrinsic to this production, and this is the route we'll follow, even when it leads to difficult decisions. And the counterfactual to that is if you don't stress this approach or you leave that leadership to someone else, is that you're licensing people to avoid those difficult decisions, which we know will come up in any production. If we're not doing the right thing, we're doing the wrong thing. The Green Book also reminds us of the importance of planning. Avoiding last-minute decisions reduces transport and waste. And I worked for 5 seasons at Pidlockery Festival Theatre, which is just terrifying. Everything moves very fast. You're rehearsing in repertoire 2 different shows a day. Once you've rehearsed a scene, you may not go back to it for some weeks. You can't stop. You can't chop and change. You need a plan. But I found that this doesn't stop you and your actors innovating, imagining, and playing. If you plan well, if you use your time well, deciding on your design early, talking about props early on, means that the actors have time to get used to them in rehearsal, work with them, and play with them. I'm telling you stuff you know again, But everybody feels confident if you're confident and planned, and then you can create and innovate together. That's the internal narrative. More externally, what if we say as directors, we're particularly looking for writers, composers, designers, staff, actors who want to use climate change as a core purpose, core feature of their work, the lens through which they see it. New people will pop up who you didn't know, but who now want to work with you because you're interested in climate change. And a lot of the most interesting artists, I think, are interested in climate change. And you'll be creating an authorizing environment for the people you do know to say, actually, I've been waiting for somebody to say that, and I want to work with you, and I want to bring this up with you. You'll be encouraging others to do the same. And more externally yet, theatre directors can be at the heart of climate change more widely. At Creative Carbon Scotland, we have our Embedded Artist project where we work with local authorities and others to involve artists of all disciplines in climate change projects. And this is not about creating art, but bringing our whole set of skills, ways of working, ideas, knowledge, and contacts to bear on the enormous challenges that those projects pose. Because no one actually knows how to get to net zero or adapt to the impacts of climate change. They need our imagination, our creativity, our ability to experiment, to get things wrong and to experiment again, and our ways of working with vastly different people. And I found that my ability as a director to influence a diverse and complex group of people with different ideas, knowledge, baggage, emotions, and experience, and bring them together to create something is valued by big climate change projects. For a project called Clyde Rebuilt, where we were shaping the future of 1/3 of Scotland's population, I was operating as an artist on the steering group working with the board, which was made up of 8 local authorities, 2 universities, and sundry environmental agencies. These are big projects, and they're exciting projects to work on as an artist. I'm going to finish by going back to theatre itself. In his terrific book, which I really recommend, The Great Derangement, the Indian-American novelist Amitav Ghosh argues that one of the reasons artists have found it difficult to address climate change in their work is that it requires thinking and working on an epic scale, because climate change works across decades and it spans continents. And speaking on this stage, where I grew up in Southeast London, I've seen so much terrific epic theatre. I see this as a fantastic opportunity. What theatre director doesn't want to tell big stories, whether on a big stage like this one or are crammed into and blowing the roof off a tiny space? So it's in our hands to shape the future. And what a thrilling opportunity that is. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thank you. One of the themes that came out from what all of you were saying was this idea of the optimistic opportunity within change. And Kate, if I can come to you first, in a way it seems so clear, this idea that we need to fundamentally shift the model, the economic model within which we work, from a top-down, hierarchical, human men at the top into a networked understanding of everything being interconnected. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the tools and methodologies that we might have within this room, and how you actually go about that change?
Oh, right. So I think in this room you have amazing combination of what Ben was just speaking of, the Green Book. So you've got a guideline, right, written exactly for this sector. You've got this fantastic concept that Amanda just introduced. I love that. Environmental and social equity. I love that. So you make sure that everything, so the green, I'm not totally familiar with the Green Book. I've looked through it, but I know a lot of it is about what are we going to do with how we reuse materials. And the people using materials are therefore bringing in ethical questions. Whose jobs are created and whose jobs are lost? And who's got control of these materials and benefiting from it? So it's always ethical of who's involved in the flow of materials and energy. And then you've got the creativity, right? And I really think that creating a regenerative economy is going to be phenomenally creative. We all love going to a cafe that you go in and go, oh, this used to be a bike workshop. Oh, yeah, look, they've got bikes hanging all. Used to be a church. Right? That reinvention, right? It's one of those things that makes us say, how can we reinvent this space and show what it used to be? So actually, the playfulness that it invites in us to make it something new but leave a hint of the old, because we love stories, we love family histories, and I think we're going to come to love material histories. So I think that combination of clear guidelines, bring in the ethics of who's impacted, who's involved, and then the creativity of making that story visible, not visible, visible, so playfully, is crying out to be run away with by this sector.
Brilliant. And Amanda, I feel like I had a little light bulb moment when you said environmental social equity. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, what is the opportunity of aligning these kind of intersectional challenges? What does that mean for you?
I think, as I said, good governance means paying attention not just to the financial bottom line, but all the way through. Who's affected? Who do we talk to? Who are we not? How is the response? Everyone is involved in that piece. So when we look at what that might look like in theatre, it means that it affects your investment principles, it affects your programming, it affects the way you produce. I think about this wonderful space, and for lots of reasons, I think about the facilities team in this space, not least because I've just written an article about them, and I was like, and I get my head around facilities and front of house. But I also think that when we talk about what's on stage and how things are used, how often do we bring in front of house and facilities? And if we did bring in catering and audience development into that same conversation, when we're talking about reusing, it's not just about the reusing, is it? It's also about how far have things come from? Where have they come from? Who does it resonate with? I feel like I'm going off on lots of tangents, but I feel like how it speaks to the whole ecology of theatre is about the more you bring in those diverse voices, the better your product is, because the better it lands with your audiences and the better your space works and lands with the communities around it, irrespective of what's on stage.
Which also feels like a creative opportunity. And Ben, you talked about the role of artists. Can you say a little bit more about where, like, I feel like I've heard you speak within the Scottish context about the importance of artists within this narrative of challenge. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, there's something interesting that comes up here, because I think that often there's a feeling, there's a sense that the sort of individual, people think about the individual response of the artist maybe, but also the audience member, and how an audience member watches an artist, sees an artist doing something, and they have a transformational moment, and then they go away and change their lives, which we all know doesn't happen, because the emotion bleeds away while you take the bus home, or you've got to look after the kids, or just life carries on, and all those thoughts bleed away. And I think what we've touched upon a bit here is the community of theatre, both on stage, behind stage, and then the community with the audience. Actually, what we're seeking to do, I think, is change the whole narrative. And so that change the discourse, the social discourse about it. And I think as an artist, if you go back through history, artists have always been at the heart of the discourse. They've been changing the way people think. If you go back to pre-literate times, of course, visual artists and plays, indeed, were a way of transmitting ideas to a much larger audience. So I think we need to think not only about what I'm doing to the individual, but as an artist, what am I saying about the whole thing? And I think this comes back also to what you've been talking about, Kate, because where you get your materials, how you get your materials, how you build your work is part of that. And you were talking about stories. We live by stories. We tell ourselves stories about who we are. We tell our audiences. We tell our staff or whatever. We tell our friends. And those stories that we tell, they shape our lives, absolutely. So I think in all ways, artists are needing to think about what am I saying in what I do, and who am I saying it to? How can I not just have an impact on that person, but actually, how can I change the wider discourse? And that, of course, comes back to organizations as well.
Brilliant. I feel as though we could just talk, we're just scratching the surface, but we are running a little bit behind, so I'm going to move us on to the next part of the day. And thank you so much for being here. Can we give our keynote panel a round of applause?